Welcome to the final session in our Bertelsmann Transformation series. I want to begin by thanking our colleagues at the Bertelsmann Stiftung for the outstanding collaboration on this series over the past 3 months. I'm Tony Silberfeld, Director of Transatlantic Relations at the Bertelsmann Foundation in Washington, and it is an honor to host today's discussion, Fragmentation and Clientelism, Assessing Reform Potential in Lebanon and Tunisia. We're delighted to host this session via Zoom and on Facebook Live with our partners, the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut and the Kawakibi Democracy Transition Center in Tunis. The driving force behind this session is the Bertelsmann Transformation Index, which you'll hear more about in a moment. 10 years ago, the Arab Spring bloomed in Tunisia, setting in motion a wave of democratic movements across the region. Today, only 2 democracies remain, Lebanon and Tunisia, and we find them both at a crossroad. In this session, our distinguished speakers will give us the view from the ground to examine the current state of affairs, the prospects for democratic reform, and the way forward. We have lots of ground to cover in the next hour, so let me start by introducing the experts who will guide us along the way. We'll begin with Dr. Jan Falco, Senior Researcher at the University of Freiburg. Jan is also the author of the Bertelsmann Transformation Index Regional Report on the Middle East and North Africa. I'll post a link to that in the chat box so you can have a look at your own leisure. Jan will give us a snapshot of the BTI results and set the scene for the conversation to follow. For that conversation, we're deeply honored to be joined by Amin Khali, Director of Tunisia's Kawakibi Democracy Transition Center, and Maha Yahya, Director at the Carnegie Middle East Center. It's a pleasure to have you all here, and I look forward to your insights. Following the back and forth with our speakers, we'd like to bring all of you into the conversation as well. So at any point, please feel free to submit a question to the panelists using the Q&A function on your Zoom toolbar. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as time will allow. With that, I want to thank you again for being here, and I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Falco. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tony, for this very kind introduction, and a warm welcome also to everybody from my side. It's a pleasure for me to join this discussion about fragmentation and clientelism, assessing reform potential in Lebanon and Tunisia. And as Tony has rightly said, we want to have a first overview over the region as such. And I think most of the audience is very familiar with the developments within the Middle East and North Africa, the region that you see here. And this is a map that we deduced from the very recent findings of the Bertelsmann Transformation Index 2020. The so-called status for political transformation. That's literally where we measure how democratic countries are. And what you can see is different color. The dominant color is this dark purple. And this is already one of the worst categories we have, namely the hardline autocracies. So where democracy is literally non-existent or only to a very limited extent. Then you can see 3 red countries, Libya, Syria, and Yemen, which we qualify as failing states, arguing that the government and the state is not present and existing enough to have full control over the territory and the developments. Few countries are in pale purple, if you wish, or in rosé. These are the so-called moderate authoritarian countries, like Turkey, since this BTI edition, but also Algeria, Jordan, and Kuwait. And only 2 very tiny countries, Tunisia here and Lebanon there, they qualify as democracies. And that's why we decided to have these 2 countries into the focus of this session. And if we take a time perspective from the BTI 2012 through the BTI 2014, 16, 18, 20, we have some charts that can illustrate the developments after the Arab Spring, which literally played out between the BTI 2012 and BTI 2014. Because what's important to keep in mind that these BTIs always measure the state of democracy the year before, which in the BTI 2012 case means that this measures the state of democracy in January 2011, which was exactly the beginning of the Arab Spring. Meanwhile, the BTI 2014 measures the state of democracy for January 2013, which particularly in Egypt, but also other countries, was literally marking the end of the Arab Spring. And what you can see is literally that we had this blue category, the defective democracies. We had 2 countries at the beginning of the Arab Spring, and these were Turkey and already Lebanon. And also at the end of the Arab Spring, we had 2 defective democracies. But this was the same countries, Turkey and Lebanon. And here's the change that we can see. Before the Arab Spring, we had one highly defective democracy, which was Iraq at that time. But after 2 years, it was joined by Tunisia as the second highly defective democracy. So there we can see already the big progress Tunisia made between 2012 and 2014 in terms of democratization after the successful revolution. The moderate autocracies remained relatively equal, but the hardline autocracies, and this was the initial hope for the Arab Spring, declined from 10 to 7. But there's also a shade over the coming developments. The first failing state in the BTI 2014 was measured, namely Syria, with the outbreak of the civil war in that case. So what we can see then in the following years from the BTI 2016 and 18 is a stark increase of hardline autocracies, because many Arab regimes have learned from the Arab Spring developments, so that today in the BTI 2020, which measures literally the state of democracy last year, we have only one defective democracy, the dark blue thing, which is Tunisia, and one highly defective democracy, which is Lebanon. So that's what we want to focus on. The other remaining countries, only 4 are moderate autocracies, namely Turkey, Algeria, Kuwait, and Jordan, as already mentioned, and 10 are then hardline autocracies. You can read them out yourselves. And we have 3 failing states since a couple of years, namely the civil war countries, Libya, Syria, and Yemen. Important in this chart is probably to see that as of today, literally, we have more than 2/3 of countries in the Middle East and North Africa being qualified as hardline autocracies or even failing states. And this makes the region of the Middle East so far the least democratic region as we measure them by the BTI compared with any other world region on the global scale. And that means when we speak about democracy in the Middle East, whether it's Tunisia or Lebanon, we should always keep in mind that this is still relatively bad compared with other countries. And I can just remind you, you don't see a 5th category that we have in the BTI, namely the consolidated democracies. There's not a single one in the Middle East, and there has never been a single one of the consolidated democracies in the Middle East and North Africa. So what we can also see is, sadly, the Arab Spring, which was so hopeful in 2010, 11, and after, has largely failed. Most of the countries have lost in political freedom and civil liberties. So if we have a look into the countries compared from the BTI 2012, so literally at the beginning of the Arab Spring until today, we will see that Tunisia is the clear winner of all countries. And even on a global scale, it has improved within the BTI methodology by a remarkable 2.7. And this makes Tunisia one of the best performers in all BTI countries over all timeframes that we have considered. Lebanon, meanwhile, has lost in quality by also a substantial 0.85. It used to be a defective democracy. Now it's still a highly defective democracy. And we maybe can discuss the reasons for this deterioration later today. Just to complete the picture, the worst loser in the region and also one of the strongest losers worldwide between 2012 and 2020 has been Turkey, where the autocratization tendency have become more and more clear over the years. Yemen, of course, with the civil war, is one of the largest loser in terms of democratic levels, as well as Syria, of course, and also Bahrain and many other countries. So for sure, if you're interested, you had a look at the website of the BTI and find out about all the other countries. Just to set the stage for today's discussion, some quotes from the BTI Tunisia report in the current edition 2020. The Tunisia report writes about that Tunisia has been a success story, but then brings an important but. There's widespread disillusionment and politics are gridlock. That's the findings from our authors and experts for Tunisia. Meanwhile, for Lebanon, the reports simply say the current period was the end of a protracted period of institutional paralysis, and it's a beginning of a new phase. But of course, these texts have been written before the Beirut blast hit Lebanon and shook the country and the society to the ground in early August this year. So I'm happy to hear from our 2 experts how the current situation has been playing out. Thank you so much.
Jan, thanks very much for that presentation. Even though it's a dire overview in many ways, there are some glimmers of hope, and I hope we can touch on some of those as well throughout this conversation. So thank you for that. I want to start by bringing in Maha. Let's get into some of the current issues if we can. Jan set the table for us really nicely. I sit in Washington where we're getting a crash course in defective democracies, but that's probably a topic for another time. But I wanted to see if you could bring us up to speed on where things are in Lebanon at the moment. Talk about the political landscape and some of the current challenges that you're facing there.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Jan. It's a pleasure to be with you today on this panel. Where to begin with Lebanon? What I would say in terms of Lebanon being a defective democracy, that's, I think, a very apt description. This country has been struggling for the past, I would say, at least decade and a half, and not to deepen its democracy, but actually to hold on to the democratic institutions and practices that are in place. It displays all the characteristics of a democracy. It has free and fair elections, or relatively fair, depending on the law that they're using. It does have a parliament, a functioning parliament. It does have a government. But then the nature of power sharing and the nature of governance in the country has created a real gridlock. And that gridlock, political gridlock, has brought the country literally to its knees and into an economic abyss. This gridlock is composed of a number of key pillars, if you want, and these pillars are also connected to the main pillars of Lebanon. The power sharing model through which the country is governed is one that is based on sectarian identity. Over time, the instrumentalization of identity by political parties and militia leaders. The current political leadership in Lebanon, for the most part, are the same people who conducted the 15 years of war. And the political settlement that ended the conflict ended it with the idea that these people would come into power. So literally, they took the conflict from the street into state institutions. And since then, they've used state institutions as a sort of a war bounty, and have ingrained completely undemocratic practices in the way positions are, or the way the country is governed, and the way positions are allocated, and so on and so forth. I won't get into the weeds with this. Just to say that it opened the door for a network of clientelist and nepotistic networks, a kind of an insidious marriage between political leadership and businessmen, what we now call popularly as the mafia warlords syndrome. Over time, the allocation of resources, I mean, the power balance between the different parties meant that they were all siphoning off funding from state institutions. As the funds in state institutions, as the availability of dollars, if you want, in the system grew less, their needs grew more, the system could no longer deliver what they wanted, which is actually one of the reasons why we are where we are today. The power sharing model is simply no longer tenable, because power sharing was not just about power, but also about dividing the spoils of state between them. There's nothing left, literally. Where we are today is that this political leadership is completely gridlocked. They're unable to reach any kind of consensus on how to govern the country. In October 29, without external support and intervention. In October 2019, the demonstrations started in Lebanon. The economic collapse also began. Fast forward, here we are almost a year later, we're in September 2020, and nothing really has been done to either stem the economic crisis. In fact, today, the Lebanese lira has lost close to 80% of its value. The middle class is literally evaporating. Just to give an example, an assistant professor at the American University in Beirut used to make the equivalent of $66,000 a year. Today, their salary is closer to $11,000, $12,000 a year in Lebanese lira, just to give a sense of how dramatic. We're now in hyperinflation. The cost of basic goods has doubled and tripled. Hundreds of thousands of people have lost their jobs. Businesses have closed. And on top of all this, the Beirut blast. The Beirut blast is Lebanon's own Chernobyl. It's a mix of corruption, mismanagement, bad governance. Just actually, I would say, pure criminal negligence that allowed close to 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate to languish in the heart of the city. The city of Beirut grew around its port, so it's not some far-off area. Again, a month and a half after the blast, we still don't know what happened. Lebanon today, just to bring it up to where we are today, there is an attempt to form a new government. That attempt, the Lebanese could not get into any kind of agreement on their own, particularly because Lebanon today is in the eye of the storm. It's in the eye of a regional storm. The connections between the different political parties and foreign sponsors has created a situation where there is no capacity to move forward unless the foreign sponsors agree to it. So government formation has been frozen. President Macron of France came with an initiative to try and push forward a new put forward, help the Lebanese to agree on a new government. The idea is that the country today desperately needs a government of, I don't like the words experts or technocrats, but at least independent individuals who know what they're doing. Much of the appointments until now, much of the discussions about ministries is always about this sect and this community deserves this ministry or this is their back domain. It's never about meritocracy. It's never about who has the best program for this particular ministry. The country today desperately needs people who know what they're doing, who are able to put forward an economic rescue plan for Lebanon, one where that can go to can negotiate with the IMF. Lebanon needs support from the IMF. The size of the debt is around $83 billion. That's the government estimate, and there are estimates that go more towards the $110 billion. It's been hit by triple crisis, financial, economic balance of payments, as well as a currency crisis. So without this kind of a government where there is a political consensus by our parties to allow it to function, the country is staring further and further into a political and possibly security abyss. As I said, poverty today, more than 50% of the population is estimated to have fallen below the poverty line. In time, this is going to have, with the political vacuum, this will have more and more security implications. And there's a lot of concern. Already we're seeing a spike in petty thefts, etc. So there is a real need for to break this gridlock, and the only way to break this gridlock is really going to be through external intervention or external support. And I don't mean military intervention, but external support. The French initiative is one. It got caught in the US-Iran tensions, if you want. The sponsorship of different political parties here. Turkey is now active in Lebanon, among others. I think I should stop here and maybe leave it to the Q&A to see what comes, unless you'd like me to elaborate on anything more in particular.
I'm going to ask you, because you've actually given us quite a few threads to pull on. I'm going to turn to Tunisia for a moment, but I am going to come back to you on quite a few of the topics that you raised, so thank you for that. Okay. I want to turn to Amin for a few minutes here, and Jan mentioned the quote that stuck out in my mind when I read the report was the same one that he cited in his presentation about the success story, but. So I wondered if you could talk about where we've come from and where we are now in Tunisia, and if you'd like at this point, talk a bit about where we might be going.
Well, thank you, Tony, for this, and thank you, Jan, for the kind of setting the ground for this discussion. As you all know, Tunisia started from very far behind. We started from an autocratic regime, a kleptocracy that fits very much into the proper definition of kleptocracy. we had a very, let's say, quick, if I may say, revolution. And since then, we started to install a democracy. And throughout the years, we have discovered that this is not an easy task. It's not easy to install a democracy. Actually, it's much harder to install a democracy than to overthrow a regime. Challenges were very, very numerous to facing the Tunisian actors of this, let's say, transformation process. We had so many actors, of course, national, newcomers, all politicians, new politicians, but also the international community tried to help. One of the main features of the Tunisian, let's say, process has been the peaceful aspect of the Tunisian transition. Of course, we had some episodes of violence. We had come very close to the edge of violence, but at each time, collectively, we made the choice to resort to peace and to stay in a peace process or on a peaceful process. You may all recall the Nobel Peace Prize of the Quartet after their, let's say, dialogue, their hosting of a dialogue among different parties in Tunisia, which saved Tunisia from the different tracks that happened in Libya, but also in Egypt and in some other countries that started a similar process. And since then, since let's say the success of this, let's say 2014 episode of avoiding collapse of the experience or avoiding the option of violence, as if collectively people got convinced that our best choice is working together to find solutions. We're not succeeding there, but this is the option we choose. As of today, people collectively are convinced that mechanisms of democracy are their best options. People may win in elections, may lose, may be in favor of those who win or hate those who win, but never has been put the option of violence or the option of non-democracy on the table. And to my opinion, this is one of the most important successes of the Tunisian experience for the past 10 years or so, 9 years or 10 years or so. Having said this, and I very much appreciate the word disillusionism of the conclusion of the BTI index, is that this is the problem. Now people started to say, the regular people, I mean, started to say that democracy is not bringing us the fruits we were hoping, the fruits we were waiting for. At the end of the day, people, of course, they're happy with election, with free press, with freedom of association, with union freedoms, whatever. But at the end of the day, the 10 million Tunisians need more food in their plate, more options and opportunities for their jobs, better standards of living. And this is not being delivered. And of course, they blame the government, the politicians, the political parties on this. And we have to say that, yes, these people need to take some of this blame as they fail to deliver. We have seen, especially in the past 3-4 years, so many political fights that do not interest very much the regular people, that they do not interest people in their daily life. We have seen, as you may know, we are at our 9th or 10th government in 10 years. We are at our 3rd government in just over 2 years. And this succession and change of governments is making it much, much harder for the economy to cope. In addition to the COVID crisis, Tunisia is going through very, very negative numbers. Unemployment is going very bad. The economy, the GDP growth, all of the debt, all of these numbers are going toward the red zone. And politicians, because of their inner fights, have not been able to create the atmosphere, the environment to start addressing serious problems. We have not opened yet some of the serious problems in terms of the economy, in terms of delivering to the people, delivering beyond democracy. Having said this, I'm not saying that our democracy is a perfect democracy. We are still trying to finalize even institutions of democracy. Yes, we have a parliament. Yes, we have a sharing of power, but we have not yet installed all of the structures and institutions that would make or would help us make a final judgment on our options we choose, a parliamentarian or quasi-parliamentarian system with the constitutional court and all of the institutions that are needed. Having this absence of institutions is of, let's say, of arbitrage institution is making or is increasing the chances of institutional instability or institutions inner fights we have today. And this is the picture of today, a parliament that is trying to find its position into the scheme, a president that is trying to step on the foot of the government, a government that is relatively weak because it doesn't enjoy the support of parties, so the government is losing some of its position in the national scheme. The judiciary that is not able to act or to put itself as an independent institution from the executive branch. So all of these kind of messes around the distribution of power and the balance of power is, let's say, diminishing the efficiency of the system as described in our constitution. In all of this, we are still counting on the support, or let's say on the actions and help of the Tunisian civil society, of the Tunisian media, and of the international community helping the Tunisian democracy. All of these three actors mentioned, I mean, the last mentioned ones, are still very supportive of the system, very supportive of the Tunisian experience. And we hope that we will be sufficiently influential to push the politicians, the real decision makers, to take their responsibility and to confirm our Tunisian democracy and probably make it move somehow from this deficient democracy to a somehow consolidated democracy. But we know that this is a workshop for the next maybe years or decades to come.
I mean, thanks very much. I'm going to come back to you for the conversation in just a moment, but I wanted to turn over to Maha and go back to something that you mentioned that really resonated with me, having spent a lot of time working in Northern Ireland. And that was this connection between sectarianism and politics. The question that I have for you is about the mentality of the voters in Lebanon, and whether it is people strictly vote along sectarian lines, the role of civil society in maybe changing that dynamic. Can you talk a bit about the interplay between voters and then the decisions that ultimately are made by politicians?
It's a great question, Tony. In Lebanon until now, voting has been, for the most part, along sectarian party lines. I worked on a study in 2009 where it was with 3,000, a questionnaire with 3,000 kids, 14-year-old, and it was about democracy as concepts, action, trying to understand how much students really understood what democracy meant and how that translated into their daily lives. What was interesting is that the kids got perfect scores on understanding what the academic interpretation of what democracy meant. But when it came to questions such as, do you think your religious leader or do you think your political leader should tell you who you should elect? It was at least a third of these students, if not more in some cases. In some cases, it went up to 2/3 of kids who said, yes, these are 14-year-olds. My father, the elder in our family, the religious figure, the politician should be the one to tell me who I should vote for. So, but fast forward to 2020, these are the same kids who are now on the street protesting this political leadership and saying enough is enough. What was remarkable about October 2019 is the protests that we saw across Lebanon. The protests were no longer in the capital, Beirut. They were actually across villages, towns, main cities throughout Lebanon. And these protests were within communities. So it was people taking to the street, protesting the mismanagement of the country by their own sectarian leadership. How this will translate in the voting, in elections remains to be seen, to be honest with you. Because the elections, we still have not had elections since then. This was a year ago. The next parliamentary elections are in 2 years. It's in 2022. Despite demands for early elections, because the argument today is that the current parliament no longer represents the people. If the thousands of people who've taken to the streets since October 2019 are going to vote in the same way that they've taken with their feet. I mean, we're saying that the vote has happened with their feet. Now it needs to be translated into the ballot box. If that were to happen today, my sense is some of this leadership will see a decline in its popularity. However, comes the second part of your question, which is the role of civil society, but not only in terms of shaping people's opinions, but also in terms of promoting alternative parties. Lebanon's main political parties are all based on sectarian identity. Most of them are based on sectarian identity. So, and in the last few years, we've seen in the last year or two, we've seen a number of smaller political parties emerge that are based on a national or a civic identity. And they're starting to gain traction. So the hope is that by the time elections come around, they will be ready to run in these elections and perhaps make a dent in the control of the current political / sectarian parties over parliament, and there will begin to influence things. Just one last comment. I know I've taken a bit too much time, but just on the link to, I saw there was a question on the link to development and how can you convince people? Because this country, after all, is going through a massive economic crisis. So if people can barely put food on the table, I'm not sure that they're going to be worried. I mean, at the end of the day, a father's going to go. And the concern here is that with the economic decline, people may now, even those who are rejecting their political leadership, may actually come back into the fold if it means that if these political parties are going to be able to take care of them and provide for them food, health services, etc. The issue is that the political crisis has hit everyone. So I doubt that these political parties themselves will be able to sustain this. To sustain large portions of the population in the way they would need to, given the gravity of the situation.
Thanks,
I hope
Maha.
that answered your question.
It does, no, and I appreciate it. It actually connects very closely to some of the things that we saw in Tunisia over the course of the last 10 years. And I wanted to bounce back to Amin on that question. You know, this idea of, you mentioned in your own comments about the democratic dividend, maybe not paying in the way that young people and old people might have hoped. Can you talk a bit about what happened to the young people who were in the streets in 2010, their views of democracy now? I know in the report, Jan had mentioned this idea of a disenchantment with democracy and not a favoritism toward autocracy, but certainly moving back and toward that direction as autocracies maybe being able to deliver in ways that democracy hasn't in the last decade. Can you talk about the orientation and the mentality of young people in Tunisia at the moment and where they are in this whole democratic process?
Well, I have to say that given the statistics we have and the opinion poll we have, one of the main features among the young people is non-participation. We are seeing a huge, let's say, leave, I would say, of young people of the scene, of the political scene, or I would say the public scene. If you ask in the last opinion polls, if you ask young people about what's their option today, is that I do not believe in voting anymore. This is not a very positive opinion. It's not as if they are choosing Islamists or seculars or Green Party or whatever. They are fed up of politics and they want to leave. The main feature that we can assess in these opinion polls is that we have a rising, I would say, party today, and this party is what we call the party of the remnant of the past. It's a party that is, let's say, glorifying the past eras of Bourguiba and Ben Ali, and this party is gaining momentum in Tunisia, not among the youngsters, but among the elderly people, but it's rising in statistics. The other feature that we are seeing today is that people, and this is from the latest opinion polls, we are seeing that people lost confidence in political parties. We still see the president, because he's an independent person, or he's an independent person effectively, but he's not delivering any more than other structures, but he still enjoys a lot of confidence. But the main feature of this last opinion poll is that youngsters lost complete confidence in political parties, in political party leaders, and in parliament. So the confidence rate is still high toward the president and toward civil society. And I would, of course, and I am very happy to on this second feature, that people still believe in civil society. And I think civil society in Tunisia can be the field that can keep youngsters involved in the public affairs. We cannot, or our democracy would fail, or would be in a risk of failure if people leave the public domain. We need to keep people still interested in the public sphere, and I hope and I think civil society can still play this role of keeping these people interested, because interested people in public affairs today are probably, or some of them would be the politician of tomorrow. The other thing that I wanted to say about this let's say disillusionism in democracy is that some people are turning, but maybe vocal ones are turning to let's say regular means to express their voices. Today, many economic aspects of Tunisia are blocked because of sit-in, because of blockages, because of people stopping the production. For them, the regular means of voting, of having their voices through their elected people, is not delivering to them. So they're turning to, I won't call it violent means, but I would call it on the edge of violence, blocking the economic, let's say, engine of the country. And this is worsening the economic situation in Tunisia.
I mean, thank you for that. I'm overwhelmed by the amount of feedback we're getting from the audience, both via email and in our question and answer box. So I actually want to incorporate some of those questions into our discussion now and leave my final question to the two of you for the end. And the question I wanted to address right now to Maha is about the electoral law changes in Lebanon, and whether there's anything in the cards that could help dismantle sectarian structures and improve the quality of democracy in Lebanon.
Our constitution, actually the Ta'if agreement, that is the political settlement which ended the civil war, foresees at the time, this was in 1989, 1990, foresaw that within 3 years, Lebanon would create a Senate of religious leaders who would have a say in major decisions affecting the country. And it was a way, because Lebanon, as you all probably know, is made up of 18 different religious sects, all of whom are officially recognized by the state, and that the state maintains equal distance from all of them. The Lebanese state does not have a religious identity as such. So the idea was that there would be a religious senate that would have a say in any major decisions that would change the character of the country. It's a way to make all religious sects feel that they have a say in the country and kind of, allay any kind of identity-related fears. And that parliament would then, once that Senate had been established, parliament would then be a non-sectarian, a parliament basically based on civic identity, on programs, as in any other parliament. That was never implemented. Of course, the way the electoral law is put together, Lebanon, I think, has changed its electoral law something like 14 or 15 times already, and maybe 20 elections since independence. There was a hiatus period between 1975 and 1990 during the Civil War when no elections were taking place. Each time the election law is changed, and there's a lot of gerrymandering, as you can imagine, and it depends on the power structure in place. There are now attempts to put forward a new electoral law. There are plenty, it's not rocket science. There's been a lot of studies on what kind of electoral law would help, if you want, transform also the, give more people a chance to get into election and kind of weaken the dominance of the current political parties. The problem with all of this, in the same way as the reform that everyone's pushing for in Lebanon, is that you're effectively asking the political parties to commit suicide. You're asking them to chop off the hand that feeds them. You're asking them to undermine their potential political power by changing an election law that is the one that brings them to power. You're asking them to reform institutions that they have used for their personal gain, for their political gain. So that's kind of the catch-22 that the country is caught in. Another, just one last answer, another, if you want, vector for possibly beginning to move the country towards a more civic representation is a Article 95 in our constitution, in the Lebanese constitution, which basically talks about people being selected to public positions on the basis of merit and not on the basis of sect. Article 95 specifies that only layer 1 civil service should be on the basis of an equitable representation between Christians and Muslims, but that everything else should be based on meritocracy. Of course, that was never implemented, and sectarianism has seeped into every single level. So that's another vector through which there's already now quite a bit of work by civil society organizations, by lawyers, judges, etc., to try and see if we can push forward through this venue as well.
Thanks, Maha. Amin, I want to turn to you on something that's been bothering me for some time, and that is this is probably the 6th or 7th session that we've done on democracy in various regions around the world. So now we're in the Middle East, and the United States often talks about democracy as being monolithic, this idea of democracy as being monolithic no matter where you go in the world. Can you tell me what democracy is in Tunisia? What should it look like? What is it meant to deliver? And is that different than what it should be expected by others in other regions?
You are both muted.
Sorry. I was saying that that's a question probably to answer in 20 years from now. It's not that easy to answer a question this deep, I would say. We'll have to go through our experience and then assess, especially that if you ask some people in Tunisia, they would say we are not in a democracy. We are in a fake democracy, but other people would say we are, let's say, consolidating our, let's say, very fragile democracy. The thing I wanted to say is that I do not want to compare the Tunisian experience to the Arab region. Today, we are, of course, having this discussion with Lebanon, and Lebanon has always been, to my opinion, a country of freedoms rather than a country of democracy. Democracy is not well installed in Lebanon, but freedom is a well enshrined principle in Lebanese life. In Tunisia, we do not want to be compared to the Arab region. We want to be compared, as you said, to other regions. I want to be compared, or our experience needs to be compared to Croatia, to Sri Lanka, to Colombia, to Indonesia, to Korea. That puts a challenge on us. If we are talking about democracy in the Arab region, or what should be a democracy in the Arab region, is Tunisia an inspiring model for the Arab region? To my opinion, this is a fake debate that would push us to lay back and enjoy our position, as the BTI put it, or as other let's say world indexes put it. We need to be challenged and to be compared to these countries I named, to Latvia, to Lithuania, to all of these countries. And because if we stick into the Arab region democracy, then we will feel the burden that we are already feeling of the opponents of democracy. Today, Tunisia is facing the heat and the mingling of countries that do not want to reach this level of an Arab democracy. We need to be compared to democracies. UAE or Saudi Arabia or Turkey or all of these countries who are mingling in the Tunisian democracy need by then to mingle in all democracies. BTI should be, or other indexes should be comparing all of the democracies or countries in transition to put a general framework that help us reach universal principles of democracy rather than particular principles and let's say identity, if I may say, democracies and peculiarities, as when we talk about human rights and women's rights. We do not need a Arab democracy. We need Tunisia to be a democracy like other democracies in other regions.
Thanks. I mean, I saw Maha smiling and nodding her head during your response. Maha, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I mean, Tunisia is the apple of the Arab Spring, no matter where it is today. Tunisia's biggest tragedy is that it wasn't able to translate the political consensus, the kind of successes, if you want, it had on the political front into an economic consensus of how to move the country forward. What we're looking at today is a situation where the haves and have-nots, the differences between the coastline and the interior, the gaps have gotten much larger on socioeconomic fronts. It was not able to deliver on the, it was able to deliver on the promise of freedom, but not on the promise of economic growth. I was smiling because, yes, I agree with Amin. Interest in the region and having even one success story out of the Arab Spring is near to zero. If we fast forward, and yet people are still on the street, by the way, and I wanted to say this before. Not only in Tunisia, I mean, everybody was talking after Egypt and then after Syria, everybody's talking, and then Yemen, everybody started talking about the Arab winter and the failure of the Arab Spring. Externally and internally, many people, these are, this is a Western conspiracy against the region, which of course strips the region of agency, as if people here don't want to live dignified lives in, under governance systems that respect their rights and responsibilities. Fast forward, last year we saw Algeria, and even though Algeria is I think you labeled it as what was it, a hard autocracy or something like this. But in any case, fast forward, you have Algeria and you have Sudan. In Sudan, we ended up with a mix, a kind of a military/civilian situation. The bottom line, it is to say, no matter how you clamp down, people are still going to come down on the street. Even though, and I truly believe that people will continue going to the street, because if you don't deliver on something, then the whole region, I mean, you cannot continue governing in the way this region has been governed over the past few decades, especially at the time when the money that was used, the rentier system through which the entire region, the countries in the region, now we've gone beyond Lebanon and Tunisia, but the way the region was being governed, the rentier system is simply no longer feasible. Oil prices have declined, rentierism is out the door in many ways. So anyway, I won't go more into this, but I was just, agreeing with I mean, it's this link between political development and the economic development that I think is also crucial in that way.
Thanks, Maha. Jan, I wanted to ask you quickly, because this has come up, is this idea of democratic relativity. In the BTI, are the measurements just confined to how well Tunisia is doing against the rest of the governments in the region, or is it the global measure that is consistent throughout?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I thank Amin and also Maha for bringing this up. It's a long debate. To cut it short, of course, now I'm in charge of the Middle East, North Africa region, but the BTI comprises much more. We have 137 countries, which we consider in the BTI. Among them, countries like Amin has mentioned, Latvia, for instance, or other Central and Eastern European countries. So it's not exactly true that Tunisia is only compared against the Arab countries or Middle Eastern countries, which overall all fare worse. But there is a point to say, okay, we should compare them also with Germany and the Netherlands and other countries. But the big reason is behind that if you compare on a too large scale, you often lose the view of details, and you can see the details better if you compare similar countries. That's why we have in the BTI, the so-called transformation countries. Meanwhile, the Bertelsmann Stiftung has a second index, which is sustainable governance indicators. And there you find all the more developed countries. But this is just in a nutshell, and I fully understand your point, and we could discuss this longer if we had more time.
So thanks, Jan, for clearing that up. I wanted to bring in another question from our audience, and this is about external influence. You both talked about some positive external influences, whether it be France or others. Maha, I want to start with you. Can you talk a bit about the latest when it comes to Syrian influence in Lebanon, Iranian influence? Take your pick, or cover whatever you think is most appropriate.
Well, I'd say take your pick. Who's not trying to exert influence in Lebanon today? Unfortunately, we're really in the eye of the storm. There was a firewall for some period, but that's completely gone now. Iranian influence is extensive through Hezbollah. Obviously, Hezbollah is a local political party, but is also very tightly connected to Iran and funded by the regime there to some extent. Turkey's influence is becoming more and more apparent. It's trying to extend until now, Turkey's been extending a soft power strategy, mainly through cultural centers, religious networks, some charities, etc. The Emirates apparently now is beginning to kind of build up a similar network. Unfortunately, with the crisis and everything that's happened until now, it's kind of opened the door and dragged Lebanon even further into this broader regional quagmire, if you want. And just as one example, the French came with an initiative to try and push the leadership to agree on a government 2 days before the government was announced, and it was supposed to be a government of independence meeting all the criteria that a lot of people have been asking for. And the French are doing it both for their own self-interest, but also for Lebanon. 2 days before, the Americans put out a sanctions list against the aides of the former minister and one of the aides and the closest people to the Speaker of Parliament. So it's clear that different agendas are at work here. And I've gotten to the point where I realized that the geopolitics actually today is stripping Lebanese of any agency. It's gotten to such a scale that the local political parties are unable to come together and agree on anything. The civil society and the protesters and different organizations are working hard to put together an opposition front, which will take time to materialize, but they're working hard on this. But the game is happening, unfortunately, at least right now, elsewhere. And addressing this, particularly the issue of Hezbollah, will only happen as part of some regional deal between the US and Iran. Saudi Arabia is also involved. I mean, you name it. Syria's involvement just has gotten much less because it's preoccupied with its own conflict.
Thanks, Maha. You know, in our remaining time, I want to see, Amin, if I can squeeze two questions in from our audience for you. One is about the romanticization of protests. That's certainly the view from the United States and probably from Europe as well, looking back to the Arab Spring. Is that the view still? Is there a romantic view of protests in Tunisia and what they can deliver? And also the second question is, how optimistic are you about the future of good governance and democracy in Tunisia? Two really easy questions, right, Amin?
Yes, very easy. I'll take 30 seconds to speak about the question addressed actually to Maha about the international actors. In Tunisia, talking about international influence in politics is already out of law. So today, we still have the mingling of some countries into our politics. I would name Turkey supporting the Islamists, but the UAE and Saudi Arabia supporting the secular, but not because of their secularism, because of their opposition to Islamist parties. So these two groups, or these two, let's say, camps, are already doing something unlawful in Tunisia, which keeps the legal support to democracy. Support should be addressed to the Tunisian country or to the Tunisian experience, but not to political parties. And of course, the only ones, if I may say, can help in this are democratic countries, are Europe. This is, and then we are talking about Europe and Northern America, which is the US and Canada. But our, let's say, we don't have, our unluck is that our Tunisian experience came in time where democracy is suffering globally. Democracy is not on the rise on the planet. And Tunisia is enjoying a support far, far less from the support enjoyed by Eastern Europe at the time of the 80s, of the 90s, when they were going through their own experience, or Central Asia or Latin America, where there was kind of a momentum around democracy. Today, democracy on the decrease globally, and Tunisia is trying to pave its own democracy in these hard times. Well, back to your question of romantic protests. Protests are not romantic anymore. Today, protests are about economic hardship. People are going to the streets not anymore for the independence of media or for free and fair election or whatever. Today, people are going to the street asking for economic solutions, asking for better job opportunities, stopping other people from working in order to get work or to gain some favors of the country, as if some people want to enter what they perceive as a clientelistic system. Today, clientelism is still present in Tunisian distribution of the economy or the structure of the economy. And many people, I don't want to blame all protesters, but many protesters want to put a step in this clientelistic, let's say, economic scheme in the country, or a remnant of the economic scheme in Tunisia. Am I optimistic? Of course, I'm optimistic. This is, I think, one of the features, or one of the main features of civil society. We are not running for power or running for positions. Civil society is very active, trying to keep this experience, to improve this experience. And optimism is one of the key, let's say, element that is needed, or key profiling of civil society. And I consider myself as one actor of civil society. We need this big dose of optimism to carry on.
Thanks, Amin. I see it's 11. It's right at the end of our time together. I'd like to extend for about 5 minutes, if y'all will indulge me, because I do want to close this with some optimism, if we can, or at least another dose of realism before we close for the day. And Amin, I want to stay with you actually, and this is something we haven't done before, but I actually like this this dynamic here, and that is You've heard your colleague from Lebanon talk about the situation there. You've really clearly outlined what the situation is in Tunisia. Is there any advice that you'd like to pass along to your colleague in Lebanon about anything that you might have learned in Tunisia that might be useful, whether lessons learned positive or otherwise, that might be useful before we leave?
Well, this is very, I would say, big task, but I would say, what can I share with the Lebanese friends? And actually, Lebanon was an inspiring model for us. Lebanon was the country where we moved, where we were not able to do activities in Tunisia before the revolution. So we always keep a very kind of a strong support to the Tunisian, to the Lebanese experience. What I can share with Lebanese friends is our mistakes. Try not to repeat some of the mistakes we've made. And I think what we can see from outside of Lebanon is that Lebanese had reached some solutions. The Ta'if agreement was one solution, but they overextended the use of this solution over time. This has been a solution in 1995. Now it's 25 years on. I think they should start discussing a new solution for their political deadlock.
Thanks, Amin. Maha, I want to give you the same opportunity to address Amin and also our Tunisian audience.
Don't let identity politics take center stage. My worry today is that identity politics are derailing the promise of Tunisia's political transition. So just be wary of this, because the example that Tunisia has set, and by the way, the connection between Tunisia and Lebanon is also historic. Carthage was founded by a Lebanese from Tyre. So there's a shared history between the two countries as well. But I would say that the example that Tunisia has set and the strength of its civil society organizations and its capacity for peaceful protest and for moving forward is inspiring, despite all the challenges that it's facing today. My main concern is that identity politics is beginning to take center stage, and it should not. It should not derail what is a very promising political transition, even if not an economic one.
Thank you, Maha. Jan, I want to give you the final word here. What we like to do at the end of these sessions is get a forward look and maybe a preview into your own crystal ball about what the BTI 2022 report will look like. Talk to me about what you think we'll see in Lebanon and Tunisia in 2 years' time.
Well, BTI reports in general are written by 2 experts per country, and they're completely free to write what they think it's right. So it's not in my hands to predict what we'll be reading in the next BTI reports. But I'm sure, and we didn't discuss this, if I didn't miss anything, is the COVID-19 pandemic, which will have a major impact on all the Arab countries, including Tunisia and Lebanon, with the major challenges coming up in terms of economy, but also politically. But I want also to find some positive words at the end. Tunisia and Tunis in particular as the capital, but also Beirut, they are places of intellectual exchange, and that is quite above the average in other Arab countries. So the level of arts, exhibitions, music, culture, and education, school education, but also university education, it's far beyond the Arab average, I would say. So this gives me hope for both countries that there is a vibrant crowd of people who like to discuss, who like to think in controversial terms, and only this can bring then social and political progress if this kind of engaged discussion continues, and I'm quite optimistic for this.
Jan, thanks very much for ending on a positive note. With that, it brings us to the end of our time together. I just wanted to say thank you all very much to the audience for being here, for spending the last hour with us on what I thought was a really interesting, engaging conversation. To Amin, Maha, and Jan, always thank you very much for spending your time with us, for being here, and for sharing your expertise. I found it incredibly useful, and I'm sure our audience did as well. So please come back anytime, and I look forward to seeing everyone again on another occasion. Until then, from the Bertelsmann Foundation in Washington, I wish you all a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening wherever you happen to be. Thanks very much. Bye now.
Thank you.